What if one of the most discussed modern saints is still widely misunderstood? Not because of a lack of devotion, but because the facts of his life have often been overshadowed by legend. And what if the documented historical record of Padre Pio reveals a story far richer and more complex than popular retellings? In today's archival exploration, we are not recounting mystical anecdotes or emotional narratives. Instead, we're reconstructing the life of Saint Padre Pio through the lens of documented history, primary sources, church investigations, certified testimonies, medical reports, and verified timelines. The goal is simple: present the life of Padre Pio exactly as the records show, without embellishment, without dramatization, and without the distortions that often appear in devotional storytelling. This research-driven approach helps us understand not only who Padre Pio was, but also how his life fits into the broader historical and ecclesial context of the 20th century, a period marked by war, medical development, church reforms, and strong public skepticism toward mystical claims. 1. Early life, 1887-1903. Padre Pio was born Francesco Forgione on May 25, 1887, in Pietrelcina, a small rural village in southern Italy. Records from the local parish archive confirm the details of his baptism, family lineage, and socio-economic conditions. His parents, Grazio and Maria Giuseppa Forgione, were farmers, hard-working, religious, and part of a community shaped by poverty and tradition. Verified testimonies written decades later describe young Francesco as a quiet, physically fragile child who nonetheless showed an unusual seriousness about prayer. Several illnesses are documented in village medical notes and family correspondence, including high fevers and digestive complications, conditions that would follow him throughout his life. While later stories often embellish his early mystical experiences, the documented evidence indicates only that Francesco was introspective, drawn to religious practice, and occasionally reported visions or disturbances that local priests advised him to treat with caution. These accounts must be interpreted within the context of rural Italian spirituality at the time, where visions were often mentioned but rarely formally investigated. 2. Entrance to religious life, 1903-1910. In 1903, at age 15, Francesco entered the Capuchin Friars. The monastery's records verify his acceptance, his initial assessments, and the new name he received, Fra Pio of Pietrelcina. However, early health issues quickly resurfaced. Documents from his early Capuchin years show repeated medical concerns, severe fevers, bronchial complications, and unexplained physical weakness that forced him to interrupt his formation multiple times. These interruptions are essential to understanding Padre Pio's later timeline. They explain why his path to priesthood was longer and more complex than typical Capuchin trajectories. His superiors tried sending him to different climates, believing a change of environment might improve his health. Medical notes from Naples, Benevento, and Pietrelcina confirm ongoing respiratory and gastrointestinal issues, though the exact cause remained unclear. Despite these persistent difficulties, Pio progressed toward ordination. The documentation from 1909 confirms his theological examinations, and on August 10, 1910, he was ordained a priest. Because of his fragile health, he was permitted to remain with his family in Pietrelcina rather than live full-time in a friary, an arrangement that would shape the next phase of his life. 3. Early ministry, 1910-1918. The period between ordination and his permanent assignment at San Giovanni Rotondo is often misunderstood. Many popular accounts describe visions, demonic battles, and extraordinary events, but archival documentation shows a more grounded picture. Letters written by Padre Pio himself, preserved by his spiritual directors, indicate a life marked by internal struggle, illness, and a deep desire for spiritual discipline. Some descriptions may suggest mystical experiences, but these letters were private spiritual reflections, not verified supernatural claims. The Church at this stage treated them cautiously, neither rejecting nor affirming them. By 1916, his superiors assigned him to San Giovanni Rotondo, a small mountain friary. This humble location would become the center of his life for the next 50 years. Military conscription during World War I briefly disrupted his stay, though his health again prevented long service. Military medical records confirm chronic bronchitis and gastrointestinal bleeding, further solidifying the pattern of physical fragility. The stage was now set for the event that would define his public reputation and bring decades of scrutiny. 4. The Stigmata event of 1918, a documented reconstruction. The year 1918 marks the turning point in Padre Pio's public reputation. On September 20th, he reported receiving the stigmata while praying after Mass in the choir loft of San Giovanni Rotondo. A number of written testimonies, including his own letters to his spiritual director, were later collected to reconstruct the event. However, what truly defines this period is not the accounts themselves, but the range and intensity of documented investigations that followed. Early descriptions state that Pio claimed to have seen a mysterious figure who pierced him with a lance of light. The aftermath, according to the documented medical observations of the friary's doctor, Dr. Romanelli, included open wounds on the hands, feet, and side. Photographs from the late 1910s and early 1920s, archived by the Capuchins, consistently depict these wounds wrapped or partially visible. Some of these early photographs still exist in multiple verified archives. It's important to note that the Church did not accept these claims at face value. Instead, the documentation from the 1920s reveals a methodical process: medical examinations, interviews, and evaluations by experts who approached the case with skepticism. Vatican officials repeatedly questioned the origin of the wounds. Investigators even considered the possibility of self-inflicted injury, though no conclusive evidence was ever found to support that theory. Whether one interprets the wounds as miraculous or unexplained medical phenomena, the historical record shows that the Church's response was cautious, lengthy, and rooted in inquiry rather than enthusiasm. 5. Investigations and restrictions, 1920s-1930s. The 1920s and 1930s produced the most intense scrutiny Padre Pio ever faced. And contrary to later popular devotion, the archival documents portray this period not as an era of veneration, but as one of suspicion and strict control. By 1921, the Holy Office had opened multiple inquiries. Reports written by several investigators provide a timeline of interviews with friars, townspeople, and medical personnel. These documents show significant disagreement among those who observed Padre Pio. Some believed the wounds were supernatural, while others expressed doubt or concern about psychological factors. In 1931, the restrictions intensified. According to Vatican directives preserved in the archives, Padre Pio was prohibited from celebrating public Mass, hearing confessions, and engaging with the faithful. These limitations were not lifted until 1933, when Pope Pius V, after reviewing accumulated reports, famously stated that previous measures had been too severe. For historians, this period highlights the tension between local devotion and institutional caution. It also demonstrates that Padre Pio's life cannot be reduced to simplified narratives of admiration or persecution. The facts show a complex dynamic, deep popular attraction to his presence, and equally deep institutional hesitation. 6. Expansion of ministry, 1940s-1950s. By the 1940s, the landscape began to shift. World War II had reshaped Italy, and the friary at San Giovanni Rotondo became a spiritual refuge for soldiers and civilians alike. The archival records include numerous testimonies from individuals who visited Padre Pio during these years. These accounts describe long lines for confession, spiritual direction, and blessings, though these testimonies must always be considered subjective spiritual impressions, not historical evidence. What is historically verified is Padre Pio's role in founding Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, a major hospital completed in 1956. Letters between Padre Pio and benefactors illustrate his involvement in fundraising and organizational planning. The hospital's official documentation confirms that he served as a symbolic and strategic figure in its creation, even though he was not directly involved in medical operations. In this era, the tone of Vatican oversight also changed. While some individuals within the Church remained cautious, the general trend moved toward acceptance. Reports from the 1950s portray Padre Pio as a figure of strong influence, yet still surrounded by ongoing debate regarding the authenticity of his mystical experiences. 7. Documented routines and daily life. One of the most valuable resources for historians studying Padre Pio's life is the extensive collection of letters, confessional testimonies, and friary records that detail his daily routine. Unlike modern devotional retellings, these archival materials paint a picture of a man whose life was marked by rigor, repetition, and physical hardship, rather than constant miraculous activity. Documents show he spent extremely long hours hearing confessions, sometimes up to 10-12 hours a day during peak periods. His schedule included early morning mass, community prayer, correspondence, and limited interaction with outside visitors. Medical notes from this period repeatedly describe chronic pain, poor sleep, and severe digestive issues. This combination of intense ministry and fragile health created a paradox. A man viewed as spiritually strong by the public, yet physically weak according to the records. It is precisely this paradox that makes his timeline a compelling subject for research and historical analysis. 8. The 1960s. Continued ministry and physical decline. As Padre Pio entered the final decade of his life, the archival evidence shifts from debates over authenticity to detailed observations of his declining health. Medical documents, including physician notes and internal friary reports, consistently describe worsening arthritis, reduced mobility, and chronic respiratory issues. These were not sudden developments, but the culmination of a lifetime of fragile health, as reflected earlier in his Capuchin records. Despite these impairments, Padre Pio maintained an intensive ministerial schedule. Verified accounts show he continued rising early for Mass and spending long hours in the confessional. Photographs from the era, many preserved in Capuchin archives, reveal an aging friar often hunched, pale, and noticeably weakened. Eyewitness testimonies from fellow friars confirm that even simple physical movements could be painful for him. However, and this is crucial to distinguish for accuracy, the popular narratives circulating today about constant miraculous occurrences during these final years are largely absent from contemporary records. Instead, the verified documentation portrays a priest who persevered through suffering, routine, and discipline. His impact on the faithful was undeniable, but the historical evidence remains grounded in consistency and endurance rather than sensational accounts. 9. His death in 1968. Verified events. Padre Pio died on September 23, 1968. The events surrounding his death are among the most well-documented moments in his timeline. Friary records include hourly notes on his deteriorating condition, reports from attending physicians, and testimonies from those present in his final hours. He reportedly uttered the words, "Jesus, Mary," shortly before passing, a detail found in multiple first-hand statements. These accounts do not attempt to dramatize the moment. Instead, they provide a simple, factual record of a man who died peacefully after years of physical suffering and spiritual labor. His funeral drew massive crowds, as documented in police and municipal reports. Thousands of people traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo, causing logistical challenges still preserved in local administrative archives. Photos of the procession, taken by various news outlets and private individuals, illustrate the scale of public devotion without resorting to exaggeration. The Capuchins recorded the closing of his tomb and early measures taken to manage the influx of pilgrims. These early administrative documents mark the transition from Padre Pio as a living minister to Padre Pio as a figure of global veneration. 10. Post-death investigations, 1968-1990s. The decades following Padre Pio's death saw a renewed commitment to examining his life through rigorous historical, medical, and theological review. When the cause for beatification formally opened, the Church gathered thousands of pages of documents, letters, interviews, medical assessments, and testimonies to construct a comprehensive case. This process is critical for understanding how the Church approaches sainthood in the modern era. Far from being a quick or sentimental decision, canonization requires a systematic examination of a person's life. In Padre Pio's case, this included reviewing every available letter he wrote, interviewing individuals who knew him, analyzing medical data concerning the stigmata, evaluating claims of bilocation or visions with caution, distinguishing between devotion-driven accounts and verifiable evidence. One notable reality that emerges from the archival review is that the Church did not canonize Padre Pio because of the stigmata alone. Instead, the focus was on his pastoral dedication, sacrificial service, and the spiritual impact of his life as a whole. The investigations highlight a consistent pattern. The Church remained cautious but thorough, neither accepting nor rejecting extraordinary claims without evidence. 11. The canonization process, 1999-2002. Padre Pio was beatified in 1999 and canonized in 2002 by Pope John Paul II. The canonical documents for this process, which are partially accessible to researchers, outline the steps taken: validation of heroic virtue, examination of personal writings, interviews with witnesses, verification of a medically recognized miracle attributed to his intercession. This miracle, often mentioned in devotional contexts, was subjected to extensive medical scrutiny. The Church's rules require multiple independent examinations, including reviews by physicians with no connection to the Catholic faith. These safeguards ensure that the canonization process remains grounded in objective, verifiable procedure rather than popular enthusiasm. When John Paul II canonized Padre Pio on June 16, 2002, he emphasized not the mystical phenomena, but Padre Pio's devotion to the sacraments, his dedication to prayer, and his compassion for the suffering, qualities firmly supported by historical record. 12. A research-based interpretation of his legacy. When we step back and analyze the full timeline of Padre Pio's life, a more grounded and historically responsible picture emerges. Rather than leaning heavily on miraculous narratives, the documented evidence highlights a lifetime of chronic illness, persistent spiritual discipline, unusual but carefully examined wounds, a significant pastoral impact, institutional caution and investigation, consistent endurance through suffering, a ministry shaped by routine, not spectacle, a global devotion that developed gradually, not instantly. This research-based interpretation does not diminish Padre Pio's spiritual influence. Instead, it clarifies it. His legacy becomes not a collection of exaggerated stories, but a testimony to perseverance, faithfulness, and service, within the documented limits of history. 13. Distinguishing legend from documented history. When examining Padre Pio's timeline as a historical subject, one challenge becomes immediately clear: separating verified events from layers of devotion that formed around him during and after his life. This is not an attempt to diminish spiritual significance. It is an essential step for accurate archival study. Across the 20th century, numerous stories circulated about Padre Pio, accounts of bilocation, mind-reading, combat with demons, and other extraordinary claims. Yet a review of Capuchin archives, Vatican investigations, and independent historical summaries reveals a different pattern. While these stories were widely repeated, very few were recorded in contemporaneous documentation, and most appear only in later recollections or popular publications that lacked critical review. This does not mean such events are impossible. It means that, from a research perspective, they cannot be treated as historical data. The verified documents consistently focus on his pastoral work, his confessional ministry, his administrative involvement, his community relationships, his physical sufferings, his long-term health challenges. These are the pillars of his historical timeline. Recognizing this distinction allows us to appreciate the real man behind the layers of devotional interpretation. 14. Public perception versus institutional documentation. One remarkable aspect of Padre Pio's life is the divergence between popular perception and institutional documentation. Beginning in the 1930s and growing exponentially by the 1950s, Padre Pio became a figure of massive public devotion. Pilgrims traveled from across Italy and eventually across Europe to see him. Letters poured into the friary by the thousands. Reports of unusual events circulated rapidly. Yet archival documents reveal that, during the same periods, the Church maintained a posture of caution. Investigators continued to gather data, examine testimonies, and review allegations. The contrast is striking. Public perception emphasized miracles. Institutional documentation emphasized process, order, and verification. This dynamic mirrors situations throughout church history where charismatic figures gain rapid public devotion before institutional review is complete. The Padre Pio case is particularly instructive because the documentation is extensive and transparent. It shows the Church actively working to balance pastoral care for the faithful with the responsibility of protecting doctrine and avoiding error, a tension present in every age of Catholic history. 15. The role of suffering in his documented life. One element consistent across all sources, public, private, medical, institutional, is the central role of suffering in Padre Pio's life. His physical ailments were not occasional, they were continuous. Records describe chronic bronchitis, fevers, gastrointestinal bleeding, intense fatigue, and complications that modern medicine still debates. Whether interpreted spiritually or medically, these conditions undeniably shaped his daily existence. When reading through the friary archives, one finds repeated notations by doctors and friars describing him as weak, pale, or exhausted. It is here that Padre Pio's story intersects with a broader spiritual theme: perseverance through hardship. From a research standpoint, what is striking is how consistent these references are. They remain one of the few through lines that appear across nearly every category of documentation: letters, medical notes, witness interviews, administrative reports. While devotional stories often focus on the extraordinary, the verified record reminds us that his life was rooted in the ordinary struggles of illness, discipline, and service. 16. A critical look at reports of the stigmata. The stigmata remains the most debated element of Padre Pio's timeline. Scholars have treated it from multiple angles. medical, psychological, theological, sociological, archival photographs, medical examinations, and eyewitness accounts provide substantial raw material, though interpretations vary widely. Medical reports describe wounds that resisted healing, yet showed no signs of infection, an unusual phenomenon. Some investigators proposed possible natural explanations, including psychosomatic dermal responses or certain rare skin conditions. Others found these explanations insufficient given the longevity and consistency of the wounds. The Church's position during his lifetime was notably cautious. Restrictions, repeated investigations, and long-term oversight all demonstrate that the hierarchy approached the matter skeptically. What emerges from the documentation is not a definitive conclusion, but a transparent record of inquiry. For viewers accustomed to either extreme, complete belief or complete dismissal, the archival reality offers a third perspective. The stigmata remains a complex, unresolved subject, noteworthy primarily for how meticulously it was examined. 17. Padre Pio. In the context of 20th century Catholicism. To understand Padre Pio historically, we must place him within the broader context of the century he lived in, a century marked by 2 world wars, political restructuring in Italy, advances in medicine shifts, in church authority, emerging global communication. These conditions shaped how news about him spread and how people interpreted his life. In an era of uncertainty and upheaval, many sought spiritual figures who embodied stability and devotion. Padre Pio's disciplined lifestyle, strict routine, and sacrificial ministry made him an emblem of such stability. From a research perspective, the intersection of public longing and personal discipline may explain the rapid expansion of his reputation across Italy and beyond. Not all stories circulating at the time were factual, but many expressed genuine admiration and spiritual hunger. Understanding this dynamic helps researchers interpret the devotional narratives without conflating them with the verifiable historical record. 18. Academic perspectives on Padre Pio's ministry. As modern historians study Padre Pio, one trend is unmistakable. Academic interest has grown substantially since the late 20th century. Universities, medical researchers, sociologists of religion, and scholars of mysticism have all examined aspects of his life. What makes Padre Pio a compelling subject for interdisciplinary study is the combination of extensive documentation, a large body of eyewitness accounts, medical and psychological evaluations, public devotion, institutional oversight. Few modern religious figures have generated such a robust archival footprint. Scholarly analyses often highlight the paradox between his intense public appeal and the Church's measured response. Researchers also note how Padre Pio's ministry fits into global patterns of devotion, where charismatic figures become focal points for collective spiritual identity. From a strictly academic standpoint, Padre Pio is not approached as a miracle worker, but as a case study in 20th century religious culture, institutional authority, psychological interpretation, and the sociology of pilgrimage. This does not diminish his significance. Rather, it reframes him as a complex historical figure situated at the intersection of faith, culture, and scrutiny. 19. The Global Rise of Devotion, 1960s present. Though Padre Pio's devotion expanded during his lifetime, the exponential global growth took place after his death. Records from the late 20th century show a dramatic increase in pilgrimages to San Giovanni Rotondo, a surge in publications and testimonies, growth of prayer groups dedicated to his spirituality, international spread of his image and relics, documentary projects and academic conferences. These developments highlight the transitional shift from Padre Pio as a local spiritual figure to an international symbol of prayer and perseverance. The upscale of infrastructure around his shrine, documented in municipal and church records, reflects the scale of devotion that grew across continents. Even today, the Capuchins maintain one of the most extensive archival collections dedicated to a single modern saint, demonstrating the ongoing significance of his legacy. 20. Media and the spread of his image. One of the most observable developments in Padre Pio's historical trajectory is the role of media. Unlike earlier saints, Padre Pio lived in the age of photography, radio, and early television. His image circulated widely, sometimes with accuracy, other times not. The presence of authentic photographs in the archives makes him a unique case. These images, documenting both his ministry and his decline, helped shape public perception. They served as tangible proof of his existence, his wounds, and his interactions during Mass or confession. They also created a visual anchor that devotional stories could attach themselves to. Media scholars note that Padre Pio's rise parallels the growth of mass communication. As photographs became more accessible, so did the narratives surrounding him. This factor played a significant role in building his global following, more than earlier saints who relied solely on written testimony. The historical record demonstrates that while media expanded his reach, it also amplified misunderstandings and unverified claims. Thus, distinguishing authentic documentation from later embellishments remains essential for researchers. 21. Padre Pio and the nature of scientific inquiry. One of the areas where Padre Pio becomes most relevant to contemporary research is his relationship with scientific inquiry. During his lifetime, physicians examined his wounds with varying levels of rigor. Conclusive explanations were never reached, but the documentation remains significant. Modern researchers often analyze these medical reports as historical artifacts rather than definitive scientific conclusions. The fact that such records exist, detailed, dated, and multidisciplinary, makes the Padre Pio case particularly valuable for studying. Psychosomatic responses, dermatological anomalies, intersections between faith and medicine, religious experience under examination, methodological challenges in evaluating mystical claims, rather than confirming or denying supernatural causes. Scholars emphasize the importance of preserving these documents for continued study. They represent a rare moment when a religious phenomenon was observed through multiple investigative frameworks. From a research perspective, the broader lesson is clear. Padre Pio's case demonstrates the limitations and possibilities of scientific inquiry when applied to experiences that transcend standard empirical categories. 22. A historical view of controversies. Although devotion to Padre Pio is strong today, many controversies surrounded him during his lifetime. These were not hidden or downplayed. The Church documented them extensively, creating a transparent record that historians still analyze. The controversies included questions about the origin of the stigmata, tensions within the friary disputes among local clergy, public adoration that sometimes became disruptive, concerns about financial influence from donors' accusations, some unfounded, about inappropriate behavior or misuse of spiritual authority. Many of these allegations were investigated thoroughly, and most were dismissed. However, their presence in the record is important. They show that Padre Pio's life was not insulated from conflict. Instead, his timeline includes human disagreements, institutional oversight, personal misunderstandings, ongoing evaluation. This is not uncommon for significant religious figures, but in Padre Pio's case, the documentation is unusually detailed, giving historians a rare level of transparency. 23. A critical reading of witness testimonies. Eyewitness testimonies related to Padre Pio vary widely in reliability. Scholars categorize them into primary testimonies, direct statements from individuals who interacted with him or observed events firsthand. Secondary testimonies, reports written years or decades later, often influenced by devotion or cultural memory. Tertiary testimonies, stories passed orally or appearing in popular literature without clear sourcing. For research purposes, only primary testimonies carry strong evidentiary weight. Secondary sources are useful for understanding devotional culture, while tertiary sources must be approached with caution. The challenge in Padre Pio's case is not the absence of testimonies, but the abundance of them. Sorting through these layers requires cross-referencing dates, comparing stylistic patterns, identifying contradictions, evaluating consistency with established historical frameworks. This systematic approach helps preserve accuracy without dismissing the spiritual significance these testimonies hold for many believers. 24. The impact of his correspondence and letters. One of the richest sources for understanding Padre Pio's inner life and pastoral approach is his extensive correspondence. Hundreds of letters exchanged between him and his spiritual directors, superiors, and laypeople still survive. These letters were preserved by the Capuchin order and later collected as part of the documentation for the canonization process. A careful reading of these letters reveals a tone far more nuanced and disciplined than what appears in popular devotional books. Rather than presenting grand visions or dramatic events, the majority of his letters focus on spiritual advice, personal discipline, interior struggle self-reflection, theological questions, practical guidance for prayer. Researchers emphasize that these letters show a consistent pattern of humility and obedience to church authority. They also reflect Padre Pio's concern for moral integrity and pastoral responsibility, often encouraging people to seek confession, avoid superstition, and maintain steady spiritual habits. From a historical standpoint, these documents are invaluable because they provide direct insight into his mindset without the filters of third-party interpretation. They also demonstrate that Padre Pio's spiritual influence was rooted less in extraordinary phenomena and more in steady, thoughtful guidance grounded in Catholic tradition. 25. The sociological dimension of Padre Pio's influence. Understanding. Padre Pio's rise requires more than a review of religious documentation. It also demands a sociological perspective. The 20th century saw dramatic shifts in Italy: poverty, war, migration, political instability, and in such times communities often gravitate toward figures who seem to embody stability and hope. Sociologists examining pilgrimage patterns point out that Padre Pio became a symbol of endurance through suffering, traditional spirituality, moral clarity, personal sacrifice, constancy amidst cultural change. These factors contributed to a collective identity that formed around him, especially in southern Italy. Pilgrimage sites like San Giovanni Rotondo offered not only religious experience but also communal solidarity, emotional reassurance, and cultural affirmation. From a research perspective, this makes Padre Pio a significant case study in how religious figures become focal points for community identity. His ministry cannot be understood purely from a theological or devotional angle. It must also be viewed through the lens of social dynamics and cultural history. 26. Padre Pio and modern spirituality. Padre Pio's influence extends beyond Italy. Throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st, devotional groups formed in Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. The growth of these groups reflects a broader trend in modern spirituality: the search for tangible symbols of divine presence. Yet archival research shows that Padre Pio himself did not seek attention or global recognition. His letters express a desire for anonymity, humility, and obedience. He often resisted praise, redirecting people to the sacraments rather than to himself. This contrast between his personal humility and the global movement built around him raises important questions for researchers. How do humble religious figures become global symbols? What cultural forces shape their posthumous reputation? How do institutional and popular interpretations diverge? These questions form the basis of ongoing academic study, underscoring the depth and complexity of his legacy. 27. The role of San Giovanni Rotondo as an archival site. San Giovanni Rotondo is not merely a pilgrimage destination. It is also one of the most significant archival sites for modern Catholic history. The Capuchins maintain medical records, handwritten letters, administrative reports, photographs, early publications, official church correspondence inquiry, documentation, post-mortem testimonies. Scholars often highlight the uniqueness of this archive. It contains an unusually large amount of primary material about a single priest from the 20th century. This extensive preservation effort enables a more accurate reconstruction of Padre Pio's life timeline compared with many earlier saints whose documentation is fragmented or lost. Furthermore, the archives allow researchers to trace how narratives evolved over time, what was recorded contemporaneously, what was added later, and how cultural memory reshaped certain stories. This transparency is one reason Padre Pio is studied not only by theologians, but also historians, sociologists, and scholars of religion. 28. Historical analysis of reported miracles after his death. After Padre Pio's passing, numerous reports of miracles and answered prayers were submitted to the Church. However, only a small number of these claims were thoroughly investigated. The canonization process requires at least one miracle verified by medical and scientific review. In Padre Pio's case, the documented miracle went through independent medical assessment, multi-level church review, expert testimony, cross-disciplinary evaluation. Most reported miracles, while meaningful to those who experience them, did not meet the stringent criteria necessary for official recognition. This distinction illustrates a critical point. The Church applies rigorous methods, not sentiment, in assessing claims. Historical analysis of these reports shows a wide array of personal testimonies. Many spiritually significant stories that could not be medically verified, a small subset that warranted deeper investigation, a consistent pattern of discernment by church authorities. This process highlights the Church's commitment to careful methodology, ensuring that sainthood remains grounded in both faith and evidence. 29. Padre Pio through the lens of modern historiography. Modern historians approach Padre Pio with an emphasis on methodological clarity. Instead of asking, "Did miracles occur?" the more appropriate academic questions include, how were events recorded? What sources exist? What is their reliability? How did narratives evolve? What role did culture and media play? This shift toward historiography reflects a growing recognition that the meaning of Padre Pio's life lies not only in the supernatural claims associated with him, but also in the documented patterns of his daily faithfulness, community leadership, and spiritual discipline. From this viewpoint, Padre Pio becomes not a figure defined solely by extraordinary events, but by the consistency of his ministry and the persistence of his influence, both of which are supported by extensive archival evidence. 30. The influence of Padre Pio on modern confessional practices. One of the most documented aspects of Padre Pio's ministry is his extraordinary dedication to the sacrament of reconciliation. Unlike the more speculative elements of his timeline, This area is thoroughly supported by primary sources, friary schedules, letters from penitents, and administrative records. Documents show that Padre Pio heard confessions for exceptionally long hours, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day during peak seasons. Friary logs confirm the volume of visitors, and correspondence from Capuchin superiors often references the logistical challenges caused by these crowds. While later devotional narratives sometimes frame his confessional ministry through dramatic anecdotes, the archival record provides a more grounded view. What stands out is not sensationalism, but consistency, discipline, rigorous pastoral commitment, structured spiritual guidance, adherence to church teaching. For researchers, this aspect of his ministry is one of the most historically verifiable components of his life and remains a central reason for his enduring influence. 31. Documented relationship with church authority. Another key theme in the historical analysis of Padre Pio is his dynamic relationship with church authority. Contrary to simplified narratives of persecution or blind obedience, the documentation reveals a more nuanced picture. Letters from his superiors reflect concern regarding the rapid growth of his public following, the potential for misunderstandings, the need for careful oversight, and the importance of maintaining doctrinal integrity. Padre Pio's own letters frequently express obedience and submission to ecclesiastical authority. Even when restrictions were imposed, such as in the 1930s, his correspondence reflects compliance rather than resistance. Researchers emphasize that this tension between charismatic spirituality and institutional oversight is not unique to Padre Pio. It appears throughout church history. What makes Padre Pio's case exceptional is how fully it was documented, allowing scholars to examine the evolving relationship in detail. This transparency contributes to a more realistic understanding of his life, free from overly romantic interpretations. 32. The role of community and local culture. Padre Pio's significance cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the local cultural environment in which he lived. San Giovanni Rotondo, a small and relatively isolated town in southern Italy, was shaped by rural traditions, communal bonds, and strong religious identity. Sociological studies indicate that local culture amplified his reputation, regional devotion spread through social networks, economic conditions contributed to pilgrimage patterns, the town's remote geography created a sense of uniqueness around the friary. Many visitors traveled long distances, often sacrificing time and resources to seek spiritual comfort. Local Capuchin records include notes on managing crowds, addressing accommodations, and facilitating orderly access to the confessional and Mass. From a research standpoint, this local devotion played a crucial role in shaping Padre Pio's broader historical identity. It demonstrates how community dynamics help shape the legacy of religious figures and contribute to their international recognition. 33. Critical review of photographic evidence. Because Padre Pio lived in the era of photography, he became one of the first major religious figures whose life is partially preserved through visual documentation. This creates both opportunities and challenges for researchers. The opportunities include numerous verified photographs of him during Mass images, documenting his aging process, pictures taken during periods of illness, visual records of his friary environment, early medical photographs of his wounds. However, the challenges involve distinguishing authentic archival photos from later devotional reproductions, identifying manipulated or enhanced images, tracing the origin of widely circulated photographs, evaluating the context in which certain images were taken. Historically grounded analysis requires looking at photographs not as spiritual artifacts, but as historical objects, contextualized, dated, and examined for authenticity. The presence of photography in Padre Pio's timeline makes his case especially valuable for historians of religion, as it offers visual evidence that complements written documentation. 34. Misinterpretations and their historical impact. As with many figures who gain widespread devotion, misinterpretations gradually accumulated during and after Padre Pio's lifetime. These included exaggerated accounts of supernatural phenomena, misquoted statements attributed to him, devotional literature lacking source citations, stories that evolved through oral tradition, confusion between metaphorical language and literal events. Researchers have spent years filtering through these layers to distinguish what he actually said, what eyewitnesses reported, what biographers later added, and what popular culture amplified. This work is not meant to debunk, but to clarify. Historical accuracy enables the faithful to appreciate Padre Pio's genuine impact without the distortions that often accompany popular devotion. In many ways, this clarification enhances rather than diminishes his significance, because it presents him as a real man living within the real constraints of history, not merely as an idealized or mythological figure. 35. Padre Pio's place. In contemporary Catholic research today, Padre Pio occupies a prominent position in contemporary Catholic scholarship. His life intersects multiple academic disciplines: spiritual theology, church history, sociology of religion, psychology of mysticism, archival studies, medical history, academic conferences, research papers, and doctoral dissertations continue to examine his timeline not as a collection of miraculous narratives, but as a complex and multi-layered subject requiring rigorous methodology. His case highlights the importance of maintaining a clear distinction between historical events, spiritual interpretations, cultural memory, devotional practices. For researchers, Padre Pio represents a bridge between tradition and modernity, a figure rooted in ancient spiritual practices, yet documented through modern institutional processes. 36. The complexity of documenting mystical claims. Padre Pio's life contains numerous reports of mystical experiences, visions, bilocation, prophetic insights, and inexplicable knowledge. For the historian, these accounts present a unique challenge. Unlike medical or administrative records, mystical claims cannot be measured, independently replicated, or verified through standard historical methodology. The archival material reflects this uncertainty. Church investigators, while respectful, often approached such testimonies with caution. Reports emphasize the need for objective evaluation, the possibility of psychological or imaginative influence, the risks of devotional exaggeration, the importance of focusing on virtue rather than sensationalism. In reviewing these claims, scholars stress that the aim is not to deny personal experiences, but to distinguish spiritual interpretation from historical data. The most credible sources, contemporaneous letters, administrative notes, and direct observations, rarely offer detailed descriptions of extraordinary phenomena. Instead, they present a grounded and disciplined account of a priest engaged in prayer, sacrifice, and service. This distinction helps maintain the integrity of historical research while acknowledging the spiritual dimension that devotees find meaningful. 37. The nature of his spiritual discipline. Priests and friars who lived with Padre Pio consistently described him as a man of strict discipline. Archival records show that his daily routine remained remarkably consistent for decades. Rising very early for prayer, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions for extended periods, maintaining demanding penances, engaging in communal life within the friary. This routine was documented in multiple sources, including the friary's schedules, witness interviews, and letters from his Capuchin superiors. Contrary to later romanticized portrayals, the record shows that Padre Pio's life was shaped far more by habit and structure than by moments of dramatic spiritual intervention. These details underscore an important historical insight. His influence did not arise from extraordinary events alone, but from a lifetime of consistent practice and pastoral dedication. His spirituality was not spontaneous or performative. It was methodical, repetitive, and deeply rooted in the traditions of Capuchin monasticism. 38. Economic and social effects of his presence. The presence of Padre Pio had measurable economic and social effects on San Giovanni Rotondo. Municipal records, tourism reports, and early publications reveal that his growing reputation brought significant attention to the small mountain town. Pilgrims required lodging, food, transportation, and access to religious services. This influx contributed to the expansion of local businesses, construction of new facilities, increased employment opportunities, gradual modernization of infrastructure. The founding of Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza further transformed the region. The hospital became one of the major healthcare institutions in southern Italy, employing medical professionals, administrators, and support staff. It also attracted philanthropic contributions, leading to long-term economic development. Historians emphasize that these secular outcomes were not the result of deliberate planning by Padre Pio, but the natural consequence of large-scale devotion. Still, the archival evidence shows a clear correlation between his ministry and the transformation of the local community, a rare case where the impact of a religious figure can be measured both spiritually and economically. 39. International pilgrimage and cultural exchange. By the late 20th century, San Giovanni Rotondo had become one of the most visited religious sites in Europe. Pilgrimage records and church documentation provide detailed statistics on the rise of international visitors from the 1970s onward. This influx illustrates broader global trends: increased mobility, growth of international Catholic networks, wider media distribution, stronger cross-cultural devotional exchange. Devotion to Padre Pio spread through Catholic institutions such as prayer groups, parish networks, missionary communities, religious publications, televised programs. What distinguishes Padre Pio's case is the scale at which this devotion expanded. While many saints enjoy regional or limited international followings, Padre Pio's reach grew rapidly and globally, aided by modern technology and the availability of verified archival material. Researchers studying pilgrimage patterns note that devotees often cite his perceived closeness to human suffering, his disciplined spirituality, the tangible evidence of his life through photographs and letters, the clarity of his pastoral message. These factors contribute to a form of devotion deeply rooted in both emotion and historical memory. 40. Academic challenges in studying his life. Despite the abundance of documentation, studying Padre Pio presents several academic challenges. 1. Volume of material. The sheer amount of letters, testimonies, photographs, and reports can be overwhelming. Scholars must carefully sort and categorize sources to identify patterns and inconsistencies. 2. Devotional bias. Many sources were written by admirers who held strong emotional connections to Padre Pio. While meaningful, such testimonies may reflect spiritual experience rather than objective observation. 3. Oppositional bias. Some early critics or investigators approached Padre Pio with skepticism, influenced by cultural or personal perspectives that shaped their conclusions. 4. Media distortion. As his image spread globally, various interpretations, accurate or otherwise, were incorporated into popular culture. 5. Language and translation. Much of the original material is in Italian. Translations sometimes introduce nuances or interpretations that differ from the original phrasing. These challenges highlight the necessity of a multidisciplinary approach that incorporates historiography, textual criticism, medical history, sociology, theology, archival science. This ensures a balanced understanding grounded in verifiable evidence. 41. Lessons from his verified timeline. A strictly historical reading of Padre Pio's life yields several clear lessons. Documentation matters. Spiritual influence can coexist with institutional caution. Suffering shapes vocation. Devotion grows through consistency, not spectacle. Myth and history must be distinguished for clarity. Even controversial figures can serve as important subjects for study. These conclusions come not from devotional literature, but from the extensive archival footprint he left behind. They also highlight an underlying theme. Padre Pio's life exemplifies a form of spirituality deeply rooted in perseverance, humility, and daily commitment. A model that resonates with modern believers precisely because it is grounded in verifiable reality. 42. Final historical reflection on Padre Pio's legacy. When we step back and evaluate Padre Pio's full timeline, through letters, medical reports, administrative documents, eyewitness accounts, and institutional reviews, a clearer, more grounded portrait emerges. Rather than a figure built solely on extraordinary phenomena, Padre Pio stands as a historically traceable example of steadfast devotion expressed through ordinary, disciplined practices. His life shows how endurance, routine, and fidelity to vocation can create a profound spiritual impact that outlasts any single extraordinary claim. What becomes most evident in the archival record is not the sensational, but the consistent. His daily prayer, his long hours in the confessional, his cooperation with church authority, his perseverance through illness, and his commitment to pastoral care. These elements, verifiable, documented, and repeatedly referenced, form the foundation of his enduring influence. For researchers, Padre Pio's legacy demonstrates how the intersection of faith, culture, and documentation creates a unique historical footprint. His story encourages a careful balance between respect for spiritual experience and commitment to factual accuracy. And it reminds us that the most transformative figures are often those who lived their vocation not through spectacle, but through steady, lifelong dedication. Thank you for spending this time exploring the documented timeline of Padre Pio. If you found value in this research-based look at his life, I invite you to stay connected with our work here on Saint Archive Studio. Your engagement helps support the continued creation of careful, well-sourced Catholic history content. If you'd like to see more archival timelines, verified miracle analyses, or historically grounded biographies of the saints, consider subscribing to the channel. Your comments and questions are always welcome. Each one helps guide our future research topics and deepen the conversation. And if you believe this video could help someone who appreciates fact-based Catholic content, feel free to share it. Thank you again for watching and for being part of this community committed to truth, clarity, and historical understanding within the life of the Church.